This is Back to the Basics, which is going to be a lunch and learn series that we'll be conducting over the next 3 weeks. I'm going to introduce the series and then we will introduce ourselves. Today, we're going to cover in-person outreach and how to develop voter relationships. Then on June 20th, we're going to cover the importance of digital communications. On the 27th, we're going to talk about building partnerships. One of the things that's going to be different about this Lunch and Learn series is not only are we going to cover the how, we're going to cover the why. And that means we'll be talking about everything from why we do what we do, how we do what we do, but also factoring in things like behavioral insights and different demographics and everything else. So we think you're going to have a really good time with this series. As you notice, it's titled Back to the Basics. We understand there's been a lot of turnover in the industry, so some of you may be brand new elections administrators, and if so, welcome aboard. So we want to make sure that we also recognize the value of input from everywhere, and we are going to have a good time. So we want to keep you all informed and keep everything moving along. So why don't we go ahead and get rolling? So I'll introduce myself. My name is Alton Dillard. I am with the Elections Group, and this series is sponsored by the Center for Tech and Civic Life, Ideas 42, the U.S. Alliance for Election Excellence, and of course here, our crew at the Elections Group. Briefly about myself, veteran communicator, 30 years in the business. I have my own consultancy now, but I used to be the communications manager for Denver County Clerk and Recorder for 17 years. And prior to that, I was a U.S. Senate press secretary. I will kick it over to Taryn. We'll go in order here.
Thanks, Alton. Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you today. My name is Taryn Dwyer. I'm a senior training associate at the Center for Tech and Civic Life. I was really happy to be co-sponsoring this webinar series. My role at CTCL focuses on creating resources for all kinds of local election officials like yourselves, ranging from courses, trainings, and webinars like these to checklists and templates. We're going to talk a little bit more about some resources later in this webinar and throughout the series. So looking forward to talking about it. Nick, over to you.
Thanks, Taryn. Hi, everyone. I'm Nick with Ideas 42. Ideas 42 is a sort of behavioral science research and design and consultancy. We work in a lot of different domains, trying to apply insights from research and behavioral science to communications, to choice design, all these different things. And one of the domains we work in is in civic engagement and voting. So thrilled to be joining this call and chatting with you all today alongside my two wonderful co-presenters. Yeah, and thank you all for joining us. It's great to see this turnout. Without further ado, we can go on to the next slide and we'll chat about the agenda for today. So to set the stage, we'll start off with what Alton mentioned, the why in-person outreach is so valuable. And then we'll go into talking about the kinds of events that can be worth attending and how to find those events. We'll talk about how to prepare for those events, what sorts of materials that can be useful to bring. And then we'll cover what to do once you're actually there, how to be ready for the different kinds of conversations or questions you might see when talking to folks with, from your community. Then we'll wrap up, offer some resources that can take you to the, help you take the next step in not just doing outreach, but doing it really, really effectively. And we'll close things out with a Q&A. So we can go on to the next slide here. And so, yeah, the why in-person outreach. And I think fundamentally, face-to-face community outreach, it's a great way to build trust. It's a great way to establish yourself as a reliable local authority for all things elections. There's no shortage of evidence, both anecdotal and empirical. And here I'm going to say some stuff that's probably surprising to absolutely no one on this call. But meeting people face-to-face, that's the foundation for strong and trusting relationships. You might have anecdotes yourselves that relate to this, but I'll go into a little bit of the sort of like empirical backing here. There's a lot of research in psychology that's found that people are significantly more trusting of someone when they hear that person speak compared to even reading something that person wrote. So the spoken word and the written text, even if everything in the content is exactly the same, people are just more trusting when they hear it come from the person's mouth. And this sort of thing certainly applies in the world of elections too. Research on get out the vote efforts has consistently found that in-person conversation is consistently more influential over someone's decision to turn out to the polls than just about any other method of outreach. So again, I wouldn't be surprised if this is entirely unsurprising to y'all, and if some of you have even moments of speaking face to face with folks in your community, voters in your community, where you've felt this bridge building happening. So that's sort of the inherent value of these in-person conversations. But beyond that, in-person outreach is also really important because it helps you creating what we could call like a digital divide, in which your voters who might not communicate as much with technology would get left out of the flow of information if you were relying really heavily on websites and social media. There's some people who spend a whole lot of time on their phones, a whole lot of time in the digital sphere, and there are some people who spend nearly none at all. And then there's a whole lot of people in the middle. So the key to any outreach, effort is meeting people where they already are, and that often means taking multiple approaches to, reach every diverse corner of your communities. So speaking of meeting people where they are, I'll hand it off to you, Alton, to talk about where these kinds of conversations can happen.
All right. So one thing that to keep in mind, and another thing that we too keep in mind, is understanding that there is a broad range of not only audiences, but also a broad range of what resources elections officials have. So think of this as scalable, because we understand that there are large jurisdictions, medium-sized jurisdictions, small jurisdictions. My former jurisdiction had an 8-person communications and outreach team. But that is not the case even throughout the state of Colorado. We have some jurisdictions where you have 3 people running elections, handling motor vehicle, marriage licenses, you name it. So again, think in terms of this as scalable, but we also don't want it to sound overwhelming, because it's really easy to not reinvent the wheel. You just simply go where the public is. So I'm going to give a quick example. I just returned from a quick getaway to Atlanta, and I saw in 2 different locations a table set up, one place by Fulton County Votes. They were actually at a First Friday event at a art museum. And then I also ran into Mi Familia Vota. They were set up at an event at the Civil Rights Museum. So there's all kinds of places you can go to get in front of people. Major public events are very helpful. Farmers markets. Everyone loves farmers markets. And I live in the state that produces, I'm going to say, the best melons, the best peaches, and the best sweet corn. There's something about our climate here. So farmers markets are very, very popular, and that's a good way to get in front of people and get in front of the foot traffic. Street fairs, those take place especially in your states where you're able to do them year round. In Colorado, street fair season is essentially Memorial Day to Labor Day. Our state fair takes place in August, which is, and that takes place in Pueblo, Colorado. It's about 155 degrees down there. That's just how we roll. Getting a chance to get to various community festivals is very helpful too. And as we continue through these discussions, then also make sure, because we're going to take a deeper dive when we talk about this on the 27th, as far as building partnerships, how everything ties in. And then sporting events. My former jurisdiction actually partnered up with the Denver Nuggets and the Denver Broncos to be able to just be present in, of course, a totally nonpartisan way, to be able to catch those crowds of people coming in, even to the point of making sure that we had a place where people could drop off their ballots as they were going into certain sporting events. So those are great ways to be able to get out in front of people. And then we have to get to our younger voters. In Colorado, younger voters are our lag group. Gray hairs like me, we are the top voting demographic every single election. In Colorado, of course, you're able to start voting at the age of 18, but at the age of 16, you're able to pre-register to vote, so it kicks in automatically. So getting both the college campuses meeting folks where they are, especially if you have commuter campuses where your students are actually from your local area, or getting to high school events. We actually have what's called deputy registrar here in Colorado, where there's a designated person in every high school who's supposed to be the liaison to the clerk and recorder, the registrar of voters, whatever you call them in your particular jurisdiction. Reaching the entire community is very key. So you can keep that as simple as attending Juneteenth celebrations, Cinco de Mayo celebrations, other cultural celebrations, but you also can start at the highest level, which is attending new citizens swearing in ceremonies. Once these citizens are sworn in, they have the right to vote. So my old jurisdiction, that was something we would do. We would partner up with the federal government and the local library and literally just have a voter registration table. So as soon as people put their hand up and take the oath of citizenship, then they would come visit us. But making sure also to understand that when you're talking, sometimes when reaching out to the refugee or immigrant community, some of those people may not have voting eligibility, but they still may be on the path to citizenship. But that's also where you have some of the deeper discussions, because not all these folks are coming from places where a United States style democracy exists. So there are some cultural sensitivities around that, but we can talk about that a bit when we talk about how to talk to people. And then, of course, you want to activate your civic-minded groups. And you can do that in a variety of ways. Again, elections are elections. We are the ones who administer. We care that people vote. We don't care who they vote for. So anytime you can get to the central committee meetings, the district meetings, whatever, of both your political parties, that helps give you some extra depth, because you as an election official, especially when you're in election cycle, are not going to be able to just be everywhere. And that's why it's important to deputize in small d, to be able to have other people who can help educate and inform. And then civic organizations, get to your VFWs, get to your Kiwanis, get to your Future Farmers of America and talk to young people interested. But those are the kind of places that you really want to have a face-to-face presence to start the kind of conversations that we're talking about. Next slide, please.
Awesome. Thank you, Alton. So that's very comprehensive. And I think that shows the vast range of potential places where these conversations can be had. Something as intimate as a new citizen swearing in ceremony, or as massive in scale as a Broncos game. So to that effect, when you're actually going to these events, what is worth bringing? What is worth preparing in advance and carrying with you? And I think broadly, there's four sort of categories of things that are really, really helpful. One is going to be something that identifies who you are. Another is informational materials. Another is forms that actually enable people not just to receive information, but take action directly at this in-person event or in-person conversation. And then finally is something that can be maybe a conversation starter. So I'll go through each of those piece by piece. And I'll also say that, it's great to bring things, even if you're just showing up, just making yourself known, having conversations, that can be valuable on its own. Again, we're talking about establishing yourself as part of the community, trusted face, trusted voice, all that good stuff. But there are a lot of different materials that you can bring that can either attract people to sort of wherever you're set up, or that can make sure that they walk away with important information literally in hand. So to the point about identifying who you are, it's great to have something that can have the name of your office, your county seal, other official branding that can ensure event attendees, identify who you are and know that you're someone official they can trust. For an event where you have your own booth or somewhere you can properly set up something like custom tablecloth or table drape, is great to have. But if that's not necessarily doable in whatever context or environment you're in, even just a small sign or a little placard, or maybe you don't have a table at all, and just like a name tag with your name and title can be really, really helpful. Then on the point about informational materials, it's really, really easy for people to forget what you tell them. If they don't have like a physical reminder, if you're at one of these, especially the larger scale in-person events, there's going to be a lot of things competing for people's attention, a lot of distractions, and you might, lay out a bunch of details about registration deadlines or the process for requesting an absentee ballot, and they might walk away and see some, of those beautiful, peaches that Alton was talking about at the farmers market, and suddenly their attention is gone and they've forgotten the exact date and deadlines that you were telling them. So a flyer that you can hand them, with information about key dates and deadlines, locations for in-person voting, locations for returning mail ballots, ensures that they can walk away from that conversation with the material they need, the information they need in their hand, and not just like lodged in their memory. On the right side of the slide here, you'll see an example of a flyer like this. Covers some of these needs. It's got the date of the election. It's got a to-do reminding folks, make sure you're registered, check your registration. And then it's also got your office's contact information, again, presenting yourself as the go-to place if someone needs help. And I'll just note real quick that this particular flyer comes from VoterCast, which is a free online resource that you can use to build flyers, social media posts, a whole bunch of different things. And the website actually will automatically customize all the details of it to your jurisdiction. We'll touch on VoterCast more in a few slides, but regardless of what sort of program you use to create a flyer like this, I'd say one thing that's really important is not to crowd the page, not to overwhelm someone with information. You can see here, it's a little bit of information, the key stuff spaced out. If you hand someone something with lines and lines and paragraphs of text, there's a decent chance that it'll never get read. So focusing in on whatever information is most pertinent. If you're maybe months away from an election, highlighting registration might be best. If you're maybe approaching the end of like an early voting period, highlighting that, deadlines and early voting locations, that might be ideal. So that's a little bit about like the information that you can make sure someone's walking away with. But you can go further than information. You can bring forms on hand, maybe for getting voters registered or for signing up poll workers. And that can turn any productive conversation that you're having, that can turn it into a new voter, or that can turn it into an election judge. People are often more willing to follow through on like asks, like these really tangible asks, when they're made in person. So this is a really great opportunity to bring those forms along and highlight them. And it's worth noting that for any of these materials and the informational materials as well, it's just really good practice to have them available in whatever languages are most prominent in your jurisdiction. So, you can translate these materials in advance. There's a million websites online that'll help you do automatic translation. But I'll note that any translation you get from a website, whenever possible, it is best to verify that with a native speaker to make sure there's no sort of technical wonkiness that's happening with Google Translate or whatever you're using. And then I'll finally say the last thing I said was sort of a hook or an ask to make of people. So once you're at an event, it can be really helpful to have something to grab people's attention. This can be like a conversation starter, so you don't have to wait for people to come up to you, depending on what time in the calendar you are, what preparation you want folks to be doing. You might just be ready to ask people as they walk by, hey, do you know if you're a registered voter? Have you moved recently? Is your registration up to date? Are you aware of a recent change in election policy? Being ready with some prompt or question like that to break the ice can make a huge difference. And then if you really want folks to flock to you, offering little bits of swag, such as like, branded pens can draw people to your booth or your table. And then as an added bonus, again, folks are walking away with a physical reminder of their local election official. And when they use that pen or squeeze a stress ball or whatever, use whatever you handed out, it might remind them to check their registration status. So that's a little bit, we talked a lot about what to bring, and we got a little bit into like how to interact with folks once you're there. So that's an excellent segue. And Alton, I'll hand it back to you to talk about how to talk to people.
Sure thing. And then chiming in just briefly on swag, and again, Nick's the expert in the behavioral part of this. People love free stuff. So again, this is one of those scalable things. Again, I worked in a large jurisdiction. So our giveaways were everything from branded sunglasses, branded Squeeze Bronco Orange footballs for stress relief, hand sanitizers, chapsticks. You'd be surprised what you can put your brand on. And then when it comes to the carryaways, another tip that we got into a few years ago was whenever possible, especially if you have something with a QR code, keep it to a size that someone can just put in their pocket. Because some of these times you go places and people get overwhelmed with flyers and they may not have a bag with them and they're trying to carry all of this paper. So we were able to point people towards key election information just using a business card sized collateral. So keep that in mind too. So let's talk. These people have now swarmed over to your tent. Now we have to talk to them. And, you know, we have to be 100% honest. The world of elections is just sort of fraught these days. It is what it is, but we have to be realistic about that fact. So these are simple conversations, but they can be difficult conversations. So for starters, make sure that when you're discussing elections, that you tie it to something that makes it relevant to people's lives. The human brain, especially, is, you know, again, I've been around communications my whole life. Voters get hyped up about what goes on at the presidential level, and the turnout sometimes 80, 90%. But then when you get down to the election level where you're deciding who you're going to talk to about getting your potholes fixed, or who's going to set the policy to educate your children, then those elections have maybe 38, 42% turnout. And so making sure that you talk to people about how elections and their outcomes are relevant to their daily existence. I'm one of those kind of people. I can think offhand of maybe 4 or 5 things that happened at the federal government election level that has any effect on my day-to-day existence. But boy, down here at our state house, when they're talking about property tax relief, when they're talking about how to tweak the budget to accommodate the fact that we have had a surge in migrants, while our city also deals with a problem with people experiencing homelessness, that's why you want to tie it back to that street level, what I call pothole voter level, where we're talking about that. And again, because elections can be fraught, someone may try to get in your face, they may be disruptive or combative, and just listen to them. One of the things that is our human tendency, especially if someone's in your face, is to get defensive. Now remember, this has nothing to do with you. You're just the messenger. So if you can tap into that part of brain that lets you sort of disassociate from that and not internalize that someone's in your face and maybe yelling or getting a little belligerent, that's very helpful tool. And so you just listen respectfully and you respond with empathy. You know, you don't have to pretend to agree, but the main reason that people spout off like that is because they feel that they're not being heard. So just acknowledge whether they're agreeing, not agreeing, make sure you communicate with them in a way where they are feeling heard and listened to, and that will also make them feel valued. And remember, you're not going to win over everyone. See, one of the things, especially when you are a professional communicator, there is no 100%. You're not going to get 100% turnout. You're not going to be able to educate every single voter to the depth that you would like to. But the fact that you're having the conversation, willing to meet people face to face, lends credibility to yourself, your organization that you represent, whether you're at the elected level, the appointed level, or the staff level. That is where the credibility comes from, having the face-to-face conversations, regardless of if they're tough or easy.
All right. Thank you, Alton. So we've covered a lot already. We've talked through, where you can go. We've talked through what you can bring with you, and, we've talked just now through how to prepare for the different conversations and different reactions you might run into. So this slide here is just sort of our effort of summing all that up into a few pithy statements. First, meet people where they are. Like find out what's popular in your community, in your jurisdiction, and as much as you can, reach all corners of it. Second, recall that face-to-face, time establishes yourself as a trusted source of information and adds a human face to your office. Elections can feel very impersonal, very not personalized and not humanized. And putting yourself out there as a human being, a neighbor, a friend, just another member of their community working on these elections is valuable in and of itself. And then finally, and I don't think we said this one explicitly in any of the slides, but I think it's good to remember that a little effort does go a long way. A full cannonball is exceptional, but just dipping your toe in is great too. So just get started, making yourself known. That's really impactful, both as its own thing on its own, and then as a piece as well of a broad, multifaceted effort at reaching your whole community. So if you take nothing else away from these sort of basics that we chatted through, I think those three sum it up nice. But with that, I will hand things off to Taryn, who will talk about how you can go beyond the basics.
Awesome. Thanks, Nick. And thanks, Alton, for all you've shared so far. So today we've covered the foundation of in-person communications. So we wanted to highlight some tips and resources you might be interested in as we come to a close. The first is the idea that attending events or meetings with stakeholders once is a really good starting point, but you may want to consider building sustainable, long-lasting relationships with those in your community. For more on that topic, we wanted to invite you to join us for our third webinar in the series on building partnerships, taking place on June 27th. For resources that go beyond the basics, we're highlighting just a few here. First, we've got VoterCast, which Nick mentioned earlier in the presentation. VoterCast is a product of Ideas 42 that generates professionally designed, ready-to-use voter communications that can aid you across all three topic areas in this webinar series. So make sure you go ahead and check that out. We've also got the Election Group's Communications Resource Desk, where you can request tailored, free, or low-cost communications assistance. And last but not least, a few things to look out for from the U.S. Alliance for Election Excellence. The Alliance, if you're not familiar, is a nonpartisan collaborative that brings together election officials to rally around a set of common values and standards, support each other, and keep skills fresh. The election offices from around the country are participating alongside designers, technologists, and other experts in the field. We wanted to make sure we noted both the communication standards and the communications resources that have been developed by the Alliance in the former and featured by the Alliance in the latter. We can go to the next slide. Great, thanks. So the Alliance has brought together local election offices from across the country in jurisdictions large and small to help create standards for excellence in U.S. election administration. These nonpartisan standards aim to support local election officials, improve election operations, and build public trust. Standards are being continuously developed on key areas of election administration, and we want to highlight a few that are especially relevant for today's session. So first up, we've got plain language, which means that your office writes and speaks in ways that allows for voters to easily find, understand, and use the information that they need. Second is language access, which means your office understands your voters' language needs, including the legal requirements of your office to provide election information and resources in languages other than English. Third, we've got voter communications, which may look like your office effectively distributing information through a variety of methods, like in-person outreach, digital outreach, et cetera, through a variety of methods to reach voters in many ways. And finally, on the screen, we've got community relationships, which may look like your office building and maintaining strong relationships in your community. You can learn more about these and the other standards, or even give feedback on the standards. So if you're interested, please visit electionexcellence.org. And we can go to the next slide. Thank you. In addition to creating standards, the Alliance has also released an online library of a variety of nonpartisan generic resources related to various standards. In addition to tools like VoterCast, which we already mentioned, there are lots of other resources included in the library that may be helpful for going beyond the basics of in-person communications. In this session today, we talked about bringing election information, documents, or packets. So I want to highlight one relevant resource from our library. On the screen, you see the Pocket Voter Guide template, which was developed by our friends over at the Center for Civic Design in collaboration with Virginia Elect and supported by Oxide Design and CTCL. This template and some other commonly available software programs, you can be able to create a concise, portable document that lays out the most important information needed to vote in your community. So you can go ahead and fill out the template with the information that's relevant to your elections or your upcoming elections, print them out and bring them as one of those resources you bring to some of these in-person events. You can learn more about this tool and the rest of the Alliance's guides, generic communications templates, and more by visiting electionexcellence.org/resources. And we can go to our last slide. And I can say that's the end of our planned content for the webinar. We wanted to make sure we saved a good amount of time for any questions you might have on the basics of in-person communications, or for our speakers to go into any more detail about any of the examples or anecdotes that they shared. So we're going to go ahead and open the floor for questions. If you're not familiar, we've got a Q&A option set up, so feel free to put your questions in there. I'm going to go ahead and start by addressing one of the comments we got in the Q&A. This person sent in a comment about there being state laws and regulations related to giveaways, and also the federal regulations for required languages based on census data and population density of ESL citizens. Absolutely. I'll start here by saying that it's super important that you start at the legal requirements, the federal, state, legal requirements for how your office is going to operate, especially when it comes to language requirements or giveaways. So absolutely start there and work from that point forward to decide what kind of methods you want to take when it comes to reaching folks, bringing resources with you, etc. That should definitely be the baseline and the foundation for how you move forward with your outreach to folks. But want to ask Alton or Nick if there's anything you want to add there.
Yeah, I'll hop in on that also, because that is an excellent point. Elections are a 50-state patchwork. So that's why it's so important to make sure you use legal as the baseline. The other thing to remember is that there needs to be clarity that you're not giving away anything in exchange for people voting. That is the nuance. At least in Colorado, and I'm sure this is the case nationwide, you cannot incentivize someone to vote per se by providing them with a giveaway. And then to the language part, that is a reference to Section 203 of the United States Voting Rights Act that essentially mandates that if you have a 5% monolingual language community, then your information has to appear both in English and the language of said community. So as we talked about, we're also going to have a webinar on creating partnerships. And so down the road, we'll get into a deeper dive about how to foster some of those partnerships. But also, because this is driven by the census, it's always a good idea that if you have populations that may be close to spilling into Section 203 requirements, that you get out ahead of it. So my former jurisdiction at least dipped a toe in with creating sample ballots and I voted stickers in a variety of language, including Arabic, Amharic, Vietnamese, Russian, and a couple of other ones. So that is a way to make sure that we're being inclusive.
Great. Thanks, Alton. Great. Let's go ahead and see what other questions we've got here. Got a question about sharing the slides, I believe. Well, I'll let whoever is on from TEG field that question if we're able to send slides out to attendees afterwards. And we'll go ahead and put that in the chat if you don't mind.
Yes, and while we're running down an answer, there's also another question or statement in the chat. And this is one that comes up frequently. The question is, my boss says our office is responsible for administering elections, not encouraging people to get out and vote. How do you feel about that? That is also an excellent point, because there's always two schools of thought about that. Now, in Colorado, where we make it very easy to vote, we have a system where we mail ballots to all eligible voters, and then they can return them by mail, they can return them in person, they can drop them off in a 24-hour box. But that is a question that does come up. My personal belief, and I'm speaking from, as Alton Dillard here, is that anything we can do to get people participating in this process is key. And some people, there is the school of thought that, well, again, we conduct the elections, we get the ballots to the voters, we count them, and that's the long and short of it. But in the context of building that trusted relationship, taking that little extra step, I think, is key.
And I'm happy to add on there as well, Alton. I think that's fantastic. And I would also add that I think that what we're talking about with all of these different methods for communications, I think you can treat it as somewhat agnostic to what's actually being communicated. I think there's a narrow nuance between making sure someone is equipped to vote if they so choose, they have all the information they need, versus trying to persuade or convince someone that they should go out and vote. And I think I can be agnostic about that point, while saying these are some of the strategies that you can use to ensure that whether or not you're trying to get people out to vote, ensuring that everyone in your jurisdiction is equipped with all of the information they need, so that if they did choose to vote, they have that knowledge, that knowledge repository ready. I think that's crucial.
Yeah, I'll jump in too and say that similarly to Nick, I think even just agnostic of making the choice of how we feel about that framework, about encouraging people or not encouraging people. I think that some of the tools here that were brought up today are helpful, even if you consider what it's like to staff your office. And if folks are coming in to ask questions, or coming in to submit forms, or coming in to ask about how they can get involved or how they can register. Some of the points that Nick and Alton brought up throughout the session, I think are still relevant to when people are meeting you in your office, which is, definitely different than going out in the community and doing some of that intentional active outreach. But I'm sure you all also meet with people in real time in your own offices, or on election day, if you're finding yourselves at polling locations or something similar. So I would say, sort of regardless of that particular school of thought, hopefully some of these tips are helpful when you're interfacing with the public, which I think is probably always going to be an option, whether you're doing active outreach or not. All right, we've got another question here. How do you recommend balancing continued ongoing partnerships with larger groups and organizations while still diversifying your outreach with various groups in larger jurisdictions? I think this is a great one for you, Alton, actually.
Yeah, that is a great question, because you put in the work on the front side. So here's an example, and again, we'll take a deeper dive in webinar 3, but in my old jurisdiction, we essentially had an elections advisory group. So what we did with that group, we brought together people from all across the spectrum. So both political parties, representatives of the older Americans community, representatives of the people with disabilities community, language minority communities, brought them all together to help be those extra eyes and ears. And to give you an idea how that evolved, this is all public information. It was a long time ago, but in 2006, we had a tech failure here in Denver that resulted in more than 20,000 people being turned away without voting. So this elections advisory group back then, they were the ones they were outside the castle with the tar and the torches. That's the vibe that we had to deal with then. But because we became a trusted community voice and a trusted community partner, now these organizations are willing to be our eyes and ears and take the message of whatever we're trying to talk about the importance of participating back. And so it is a balance. And again, I'm going to keep harping on the word scalable. I came from a jurisdiction with 500,000 voters. Some people think that's large until you talk to the folks like in LA County and they just say, we have precincts close to that size. Are you kidding? So remember, the work is going to be on the front end, and then that is what's going to help balance out bringing in the newer folks, because you'll already have an infrastructure that you've built into place.
For fear of sounding like a broken record, I'll add too that sometimes starting at the legal requirements could be a helpful method for where to put your time. So we already talked about how some folks have federal requirements that require election information or election materials to be provided in certain languages. But there are also requirements of other groups or other entities that might be helpful for you to keep an eye on. So for example, higher education institutions have certain requirements or have to make good faith efforts depending on what kind of institution they are to provide voter registration materials. The same thing is true about social service agencies or organizations. So if you know that there are some entities that receive public funding or have requirements like that, either at the federal or at the state level, investing in those partnerships at the onset can set those types of entities up for success in doing some of this nonpartisan election education work. The partnerships could end up so to speak, paying dividends in the end, or, being something that is reliable and sustainable, and getting that information out there without you or people from your office being the ones to, solely be responsible for, reaching every single voter or every single person. You can put the information out in general spaces, like we're going to talk next week about digital communications. If your election website is like thoroughly up to date, then all of those other folks who are interested in sharing that information out in good faith will have the information that they need without you having to meet with every single person. But establishing those kinds of relationships at the onset could be really helpful.
And it'd also be interesting to hear if people want to put in the Q&A how you all deal with your older American voters. And I'm one of those kind of people. I'm on the AARP advisory board here in Colorado. And so we're sort of graduating away from the term senior to older American, in case you're wondering why I'm using that term. But back to Taryn's point about, various legalities here in Colorado, we also have to be able to get into group residential facilities to be able to help facilitate voting there. And so I'm no lawyer, but I think the deal is if a nursing home, we'll use that term, even though that's kind of going away, I'll call it nursing home care center, something like that. If these places do not offer their residents locked mailboxes to be able to receive their ballot, we actually send bipartisan teams physically to these centers to actually facilitate essentially pop-up voting. So we have someone there to answer questions. We take our accessible voting tablet. We take the paper ballot with the ballot style that those voters are eligible to vote on. But that's one of the things that fascinates me about the world of elections, again, is that 50-state patchwork. So I'd be very interested just to hear how people deal with that population if someone wants to drop that in the Q&A.
I'll pop in to say that someone put in the Q&A that they are developing strategies to engage and said it may be helpful to adopt a train the trainer model. So the idea that you're training other people to train other people or training other people so they can share out the information. Best practices, training, common errors, and how to avoid them, etc. So I think that is another good strategy that's not just applicable to older adults, but probably all kinds of communities. And someone else just dropped in approaching older adult outreach with an equity lens.
Yeah, that is key. So again, at least in my state, that is a mandate. So it doesn't make any difference if you're in the affluent part of town or the non-affluent part of town. And that's why it's important that you make sure to get out in front early by making sure you have good contact with essentially the activities director of these places. They were usually the person that we would interface with. And so, and equity is a key thing. And so that's why, you're going to hear all this tied together, because again, we'll be talking in the next webinar about digital communications. But you always want to make sure to, as I think Nick mentioned, avoid creating a digital divide. So part of equity, and this is why it's so important to meet people where they are. So if you're at your, local housing authority or somewhere like that, not everyone there may have access to technology. And so that's one of the things that actually reinforces our point about the importance of not only face-to-face interaction, but getting into all communities, ethnic communities, language minority communities, but all communities, all socioeconomic levels. Can't just spend all your time in the burbs. Sometimes you're going to have to go into the housing projects, but that is being inclusive of getting everybody informed about voting. Again, not trying to, incentivize them to vote or anything like that. I'm one of those kind of people, people fought and died for this right. So anything we can do to get people participating, I'm with, but at minimum, you get the information in front of them so they can make their own decision.
Great, thanks. Thanks for those questions and thanks for these responses. Just want to bump before we get to the next question that we should be able to send the slides out. So for the folks who were asking that earlier, we should be able to send these slides to you after. All right, next question. How do you feel about election commissioners being scared to quote unquote rock the boat? I understand why they are, but this has been a damper on our communication strategy.
I can start out with that one too, and then Nick, maybe you can provide some behavioral insights. Man, proud American. We've been a country for 260 years. We're still learning some things about how democracies operate. But when it comes to rocking the boat, you do have to factor in, back to the legality thing, how your jurisdiction is set up. In Colorado, the clerk and recorders are the chief elections officials of their county, and so they are elected. Certain counties have a county commissioner set up. Certain counties, my old county is a home rule city and county, which is actually designated as such in the state constitution. So because of what happened in that 2006 election, my former county, it's actually codified in our local laws that we get the resources to conduct successful elections. So we haven't really had that kind of issue. And, again, we are totally nonpartisan with this, but because of all the heat that elections officials are getting, there are ways to rock the boat, be progressive, be able to, again, get information in front of people. I want to keep echoing Nick's point. We're trying to get voter information in front of the voters. What they do with it is their business. But for those of you who may be in an appointed position or have to report up to an elected body, we understand that that may be slightly harder waters to navigate. But if you keep it in the lens of making sure that people are able to participate, and that is why we are rocking the boat or saying, okay, this is the statutory minimum, but why not go aboard? I'm going to use a very quick example from my former jurisdiction. We had one thing that we were in charge of. We have what's called the Taxpayer Bill of Rights in Colorado. Anytime a ballot issue affects debt or taxes, you have to produce a guide with the full language and give the public the opportunity to chime in pro and con. We had a former city council member who said, hey, all ballot questions should get that same treatment. So even though it was not at the time a legal requirement, once it became a legal requirement, we're like, okay, here's a mailing that's going out to all voter households. So why not go above the statutory minimum of the date of the election and one time the vote center's open? Why not stick a voter registration form in there? Why not put additional voter information? We have to send this mailing out anyhow. So why do this guide and then send 4 other follow-up mailings with different kinds of information when you can chalk it that full? So I bring that up as an example of an entity, which was our city council, that technically had no power over the elections administration part. But when they came up with that suggestion, we worked with them to figure out a way to best execute it.
Yeah, I can build off that real quick, since you did mention sort of like the behavioral science side of things. And I can speak to, these two have much more experience on the election side of things, but I can say from the sort of psychology, what we'd call this in the business is risk aversion, which is a very, very understandable attitude to take when under a lot of scrutiny. And what I'll say is that I think that you can try to find moments where the risk feels less acute and less salient, and capitalize on those moments to maybe then pursue some of those more ambitious or out there approaches. I think the statutory minimum can be really, really tempting to just do what is required and then focus on maybe some of the things that are coming under more scrutiny, or the things that feel more mission critical. But I think there are opportunities maybe in shortly after elections take place, when there's a little bit more bandwidth, a little bit less sort of pressure and attention, to consider some voter outreach strategies that are maybe not part of the existing core. Something like bring voting machines to a high school and show high school students how they work, and if pre-registration is offered in your state, pre-register the students. Something like that might seem like rocking the boat 2 months before an election, but maybe 2 months after the general might seem like something that is more accessible and less putting yourself out there.
I'll jump in and add just like a validation that it's incredibly understandable why folks who are working in elections have are scared or have fears or anxieties around being public figures. Being an election administrator is a lot different now than it was in the political climate even 10, 20, certainly 20 years ago. It just validating that anxiety and that concern, I think is one thing that feels really important. I would add too that something that this question is making me think of are the ways in which, as election officials, folks have to communicate, trusted information and speak from a place of authority, especially in the face of, election misinformation, which sort of feels like a little bit of an undercurrent to this question. And so if that's something that's of interest to folks, we do have resources on the Alliance website in the library about specifically speaking to election misinformation or engaging in crisis communications. So just wanted to flag, there's a really great resource from the elections group. That's a crisis communications toolkit, especially for folks who are speaking, in the times of responding to a crisis or responding to an emergency. I think that could be of interest. In those kinds of situations, CTCL also has a variety of resources related to responding to election misinformation and speaking from a place of authority as election officials. We've got a checklist for combating election misinformation, some courses, including a newly updated self-paced course on communicating trusted election information and responding to election misinformation as an election official. So maybe having some of those tools or resources could be helpful, especially if you're feeling that fear or anxiety in times where you might be facing some of that scrutiny or some of that concern in your community about trusting the election process. Having those kinds of checklists or templates, resources could provide a comfort, I guess, in having something to go off of. But yeah, just wanted to validate that concern and that fear. Okay, just wanted to address too, somebody asked if the recording could be made available. I love hearing that folks are saying they want to share this with other folks on their team, and just confirming, I think it's been answered in the chat, but we should be able to send out the recording, or the recording will be made available online. So you can revisit this at another time. Okay. So we've got about 2 minutes left. We've got a question in here that is about transitioning. So this person's mentioning our large Texas County, the Election Commission hires and fires our election administrator, but otherwise has little oversight of the election administrator. If the commission were to decide to replace our elections administrator, does a support system exist from the EAC or other orgs for these sorts of transitions?
Boy, that's an excellent question. I certainly don't have a lot of expertise in that, but by tapping into some of the resources that Taryn mentions, that would help. But also, that's why it's important to build a bench. And so regardless of how your jurisdiction is structured, you want to have your organization what I call Mack truck proofed. So if someone happens to depart suddenly under whatever circumstances, that question brings up why it is so key to document every process and every procedure. So if something unfortunately causes an involuntary departure or a departure that was planned, then you have the ability to pick up the binder and keep going.
Thanks so much, Elton, for taking a swing at that one with 30 minutes to spare. Really appreciate it. We're at time now. So I just wanted to wrap by saying thank you so much for attending this session. Like we mentioned at the top, we've got 2 other sessions in this series coming. Next week at the same time, we'll be talking about digital communications. So that is going to be the 20th, so June 20th, Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern time we'll start. And then we have another session, June 27th at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for building partnerships. So that is the end. Thank you so much to Nick and Elton and TEG and all of our co-sponsoring organizations for this session. And thanks to all of you.
Hey, have a good day. Hang in there, everybody.